hope you all showed up today with something to write with, because today's video is going to be huge and you're gonna want to take notes. On this episode of the Bedrock Guide, I'm gonna show you the best tips and tricks on how to take a bunch of random builds in the same area and turn them into one connected and beautiful finished base. And obviously, tip number one goes without saying, make sure you like and subscribe to this channel, because I'm gonna be doing a whole lot more on this series after this video is done. We're just getting started. But actually, the real first tip of this video is to get some good perspective on what you need to do in your base by finding a good vantage point to look at it. I absolutely love the view from the top of the fish farm. You can see everything in the base, but at the same time, it makes everything look kind of small. Whether your base looks big or small, a lot of times comes down to forced perspective. And there's a lot of things that we can do to force the perspective to make this thing look huge. And that brings me to tip number two. Start by shaping the land. I'm gonna have a pond over here that runs into a river that eventually leads over to a waterfall. But as you can see, there's no water. And so the first thing that I'm gonna do, I'm gonna terraform this some more and dig out a bigger shape where this pond and river are gonna go. The main thing I wanna keep in mind is that I wanna leave enough room for my paths, especially because there's not a whole lot of room over on this side, and I've already got buildings put into place, so I've got a very specific amount of space that I can work with. After all that digging, I've got a shape that I'm pretty happy with, but it's still kind of bland. My next tip is to texture the land that you just terraformed. I'm not gonna worry about the edges of the pond just yet. We're gonna leave them as is, but I'm gonna go ahead and dig out one more layer, exactly how this bottom layer is shaped, and then replace all of this with andesite. It's always easy to start with a flat or blank canvas and then texture from there versus trying to do it all at once. I know this doesn't look very good right now, but just trust the process. I'm gonna use some gravel and cobblestone and mossy cobblestone and very sparingly some coarse dirt. And in a matter of mere seconds, or actually hours, you'll get something that looks a little bit more believable. And believe me when I say I've got no transition into this next tip. It's about transitions. I need to go through and start blending and transitioning all of this land so that it matches this pattern, but slowly blends into just the grass up here. And the finished product should look something like this. And this. And I think that looks pretty good. This next tip is honestly probably one of the most important, so don't forget it. When you think you're finished, you're not. There's one more detail I want to add to this that is absolutely the biggest flex in the world, and honestly couldn't have been said a few years ago, but diamond ore. Thanks a lot, Randy. It is so difficult to find stone diamond ore. I went mining for over an hour and a half on a stream the other day, and I only found 6. I've also got some coal, because I think it would be cool to sprinkle some of this in throughout. And obviously, we're not going to get a lot of sprinkling with 6 diamonds, but I'll try to keep it in places where I know it's going to be seen. It's very subtle, especially when we get the water in there, but it adds just a little bit of pop of color, and hopefully as we're walking along the way, it'll catch our eye. Talking about that forced perspective again. If you're like me, you love a good water feature in your base, and obviously, a water feature needs water. That's the next tip. Now that this is all done and looking good, let's cover it back up with the ugliest block possible. BluJay, have you lost your mind? Yeah, probably, but that's not related to this. I don't know about you, but I like it. I might keep it. I'm not gonna keep it. Next, we're gonna fill this entire thing with 2 buckets of water. If you are strategic with water, you actually can fill this entire space with 2 buckets. You just have to place one here and then skip a block and place another so that you get an infinite water source and can pick it right back up and it'll fill right back in, and then we can just kind of keep going with this. As we continue to place water, it will spread and merge into more water sources, and eventually it will fill in this entire space, and then we can go back in and dig out all of this netherrack and have a beautiful pond and stream headed over toward our waterfall. Now that I've got enough water sources in here, I actually don't even have to do much. I can stand on the edge and place one water source and just watch it trickle all the way across and keep going. There's a few spots here and there in the corners we might have to fill in, but for the most part, this is the easiest job of the entire project. Remember how I said earlier, when you think you're finished, finished? You're not? We're not finished. Okay, yeah, I'll admit, it looks way better without the netherrack. And while this looks pretty good, there's a few more small details that we can do to spice it up and finish it off. And the first of which is bone mealing the coarse dirt and gravel to get a little bit of greenery down here. We won't do it to every piece of gravel and dirt, but I'll mix in just enough to get some more variety. And anytime coral spawns, I'm just gonna go ahead and break that. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to have coral in a pond, even though it does look pretty cool. Not quite the look we're going for. In addition to the seagrass, I'm also gonna take some stone buttons and place them down as if they are little bitty pebbles on the bottom of the water. And I'm gonna have to correct some of this. Unfortunately, I told you, Minecraft water mechanics are kind of silly. So even though we placed water on the top surface of all of that netherrack, when we broke it, technically none of the water down here are full water sources, so you're gonna get some weird anomalies like this when you place things down, and so we can just fill it in with a bucket of water and move on. One more final detail, in addition to the stone buttons, I'm gonna use some polished black stone buttons to have a slightly different color of rock, and I'm gonna use these very sparingly. I don't want too many because I don't want it to look cluttered, and I'd say we're pretty well accomplishing that goal. And with that, I'd say the water feature of my starter base is done. I'm not gonna lie, from this angle, kind of looks like a jellyfish. Maybe I'll call this Jellyfish Pond. The name of that pond might be really lame, but this next tip is not. Building paths actually will bring the entire thing together because it quite literally connects every build in the base. For a long time, I have had these dirt paths lining the area, and so now it's time to start replacing them with the actual paths. To start, I'm gonna dig out all of the paths, but I'm gonna dig out one on each side so that I have a 3x3 space. That 3x3 space might flex a little bit as we go around corners, and we'll blend things in and do some transitioning and texturing just like I did with the pond. This part doesn't have to be completely exact, just get close, and once we get to filling it in, it'll make a lot more sense. Now that I've got all of the pathways dug out, it's time to start placing blocks, and I'm gonna do that the same way I started the pond and the river, and it's just gonna be a flat path made of andesite. For the most part, I'm gonna try to just do the straight paths first, and then work on the curves to connect it all up. So, for example, right here, that looks kind of boring. So, I'll add one here. Maybe I'll add one here as well. And then maybe I'll readjust where this path is gonna go and cut it back a little bit. This is all gonna look a lot better once the texturing comes into play, so just bear with me. There are also some offshoots to the main path. For example, this path that leads to the barn, or this path that leads to the branch mine, and I'm gonna leave those alone for the time being, meaning I'm not gonna fill them in with andesite. I've got a slightly different idea of what I want to do with those, but I'll hold off on that for now. The next part of this path design is going to be very similar to what we did with the water. I'm just going to texture all of this with gravel and mossy cobble, but I've got a few extra blocks that we didn't use before to help shape out this pathway. And those blocks include dark oak fences to outline the path, full moss blocks to provide some color variation, moss carpets to provide some height variation, and I even tossed in some buttons just like we did over in the pond, but also included some mossy cobble slabs to make some giant boulders. Oh yes, I also mentioned that I was going to do something slightly different with these side paths. It's the same concept, just with the path blocks and coarse dirt and moss, and that's pretty much it for paths, except for a few places where they dead end into the river, and so rather than swimming across, my next tip is to build a couple of bridges. A little bit before the water's edge, I'm gonna stop right here and turn around and place a couple of upside down stairs, and then some right side upstairs, and then repeat that process again to elevate our bridge a little bit above water level, and then use some trapdoors to smooth out the transition to the next block, which happens to be campfires. Bonus tip, don't leave them lit, because it's gonna hurt to walk across. You can douse the flames of campfires with water buckets or shovels. Either way is fine. I've got a functional bridge, but it doesn't look very good, so I'm gonna beef it up with some pillars made out of logs, and then I'm gonna add some andesite walls and dark oak fence gates for the railing. And one really cool trick with this, if you attach a fence gate to a wall, it will lower it slightly below the next fence gate that you place, so it gives it a little bit of an arched shape, which I think looks pretty cool. And after looking at it, I actually don't like the andesite walls. I'm gonna swap them out for cobbled deep slate walls instead. Yep, that's much better. I've got the first bridge completed, but I've also got a second place where the pathways cross the river. So for this one, I just need a pretty small footbridge. That'll work just fine. After you've done a decent amount of work, it's always a good idea to take a step back to look at everything and make sure you're happy with it before moving on. All of the paths are done, including a bridge here and a tiny footbridge there. I built up the rocks here a little bit, so they're not so flat against the water. I think that looks so much better, but I've still got a lot of empty space around the area. I think it's time to build some trees, and not just any trees. I'm gonna build a few custom trees. I want to build a custom cherry tree right next to my house, but I'm not actually a big fan of the cherry wood, so I'm gonna replace it with mangrove wood instead for the trunk and the basic structure of the tree. I built a couple of offshoots with the logs in varying directions and varying heights, and I think that looks pretty good. I also think that spruce fences match the mangrove log bark really well, so I'm gonna use these spruce fences for smaller branches, and then I'm gonna start surrounding these branches with cherry tree leaves and fluff them out from there. And eventually you'll have something that looks like this. That's not bad. There's something that we can do to polish it even more, and that's to go up into the canopy of the tree and connect all of the individual sections of the tree up with these cherry tree leaves just to fill it all in, and then you'll have a really cool custom cherry tree that looks good from every angle. This is where things get a little bit more tricky. Not because this is particularly difficult to build, but because we have to build a lot of these things. I'm gonna build some custom spruce trees with dark oak fences for the trunk and the branches, and then I'm gonna use a mix of birch leaves and spruce leaves just to give that slight color variety that will make these custom trees look so much better. So there's one, not bad. There's three, getting better. How about a whole forest? This makes walking around this side of the base so much more immersive, and it kind of forces your eye to look at certain things when you walk by. For example, this is pretty much the only place we can see the entirety of the wizard tower. If I come over here, you can get a pretty decent look at it, but it's blocked off by some of the trees. But this honestly might be my favorite view. As we're coming across the footbridge here, you can only see the top, and it makes this build look larger than life. And it makes this whole area seem larger than life as well, especially because our little librarian house is hidden and tucked away back behind here as well. And believe it or not, I'm not done. Unfortunately, I have to be done with the forest for today's video, otherwise this thing is never going to get released. But I do think on an upcoming live stream, I will tackle the rest of the trees around here, but before we do that, I've got just a couple more tips for you. You might have noticed that these are not all custom trees. All of the ones by the path that I'm immediately going to see as I walk by are custom. But then, in order to fill this space out a lot more without having to build every single tree in here custom, all of the background trees are the standard Minecraft trees, and I've mixed in a few oak as well. While that's a good start, my goal is kind of to fill in all of this space, all of that space, and maybe some of this space, leaving a lot of this as open field so that we're not obstructing the view of the mountain range. But I've got a lot of work left on this area before I can call it complete, and it's gonna take a while. This next tip is super important, especially now that I've covered the area with trees, and it's gonna be a lot darker under those trees. If I want to be able to walk around my base at night without worrying about creepers spawning on the paths, it's gonna be a good idea to light them up. There's a few different tips and tricks that we can use for that purpose. The first of which is utilizing these lanterns. They look really nice, and we can strategically place them throughout the base. I would use this method sparingly for things like placement on rocks or bridges, because if you're not careful, it will easily cross into the territory of torch spam, which absolutely looks terrible. And once you've found a good balance of putting the lanterns on the ground, you can go through and light some areas with torches, but it's going to be important to hide these. For example, this area right here is a little bit dark, and I think what we could do is dig out this piece of grass right here, dig one more piece of dirt right there, place a torch in the hole, which lights up this area very nicely, nicely, place a leaf block over the top of it, and you'll never even know that it's there. The other thing that you could do if you have some dark spaces on your pathway itself is to find a matching block, dig it out, dig one down just like we did over there, place a torch, and then replace the block with a slab. But if you place the full block right back over it, it's just going to block the light. So that's a cool little trick that you can use to hide lighting underneath your paths or floors or whatever you're going to use slabs on. One last quick look before the sun comes up, we can look around and see that the whole path is lit up. There's still a few little dark spaces here and there, but I think that's okay. I've got one last tip to share with you, and that is just to go crazy with some bone meal. And when I say go crazy with the bone meal, you still kind of gotta be a little strategic with it. But in order to smooth out some of the rough lines along the paths, you can take some bone meal and grow some tall grass. I think I'm gonna keep that. I might take out a lot of the other colors of flowers because I don't want to overdo it, but strategically placing some bone meal throughout your base, especially if you're going for a little bit more of an overgrown look, will help the whole thing to come together. If you happen to overdo it and it starts to just look messy, it is okay to go in and dig some of the grass out. It's a hard balance to strike, and you just kind of have to feel it out. And before you know it, all of these details combined form a completed base. That's it. The starter base is done. That doesn't necessarily mean we won't ever come back here again, because obviously there's some space behind me. We could easily expand over here and back here, but for the purposes of getting this world up and running, the starter base is done. And I know it seems like we've been here forever because we kind of have, but I'm gonna miss this place. I've got one final tip for you today before we end out the episode, and that is clean up your mess. I've got these double chests laying around the entire base because of projects that I've put together and never cleaned up after myself, but that's gonna be something I do off camera. I'm gonna go ahead and call it a day right here. Let me know one new thing that you learned in the comment section. If you didn't learn anything new, just let me know something you liked about the base. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe if you're new, and hey, don't go anywhere. There's more Bedrock Guide content on the way.